digitally enhanced learning and teaching with respect to three themes in particular, which are strategy and organizational culture, curriculum and assessment, and international partnerships. And we also want to explore how we can learn from each other and co-develop knowledge on the strengths and opportunities of digitally enhanced learning and teaching solutions. Next slide, please. So as you saw in the title of this workshop series, it's called Developing a High Performance Digital Education Ecosystem. So we chose this title so that it would align with the key objectives and priorities of the current Digital Education Action Plan, which runs from 2021 to 2027. And according to the action plan, so fostering the development of a high performance digital education ecosystem includes infrastructure, connectivity and digital equipment, effective digital capacity planning and development, digitally competent and confident teachers, as well as high quality learning content, user-friendly tools and secure platforms, among others. And several of these topics are being discussed as part of the DIGI-HE project in general and specifically during this workshop. So before I hand over to Michael Gabel to present the project, I'd also like to inform you that this workshop is being organised in partnership with Eden Digital Learning Europe. So it's a pleasure to be working with them today. So I'll hand over to Michael Gabel, who is the Director of the Higher Education Policy Unit at the European University Association. Over to you, Michael.
I think I can't move them.
Yes, Gemma will move them for you.
Okay. Oops, no, they're gone. Hello, good afternoon, everybody, once again. I think I can't see the slides. Oh, okay. And the next one, please. Seems I can't move them. Next one. Okay. Just to give you a sense what the project is about. So we started in January 2020, but the plan has, of course, been developed long before. The project has the objective to encourage self-reflection on digitally enhanced learning and teaching at European higher education institutions, and to strengthen their strategic approaches and contribute to capacity building. And you get an overview here on the consortium. It's a partnership of 5 institutions, and then we have also some associated partners. I will not read them out here, but you will realize that we are joined by some colleagues here from Dublin City University, Vitaras Magnus, who we will meet in a minute, and also our associate partners. And I also saw that colleagues from Uvascular are in the audience. Next one. Gemma? Thanks. Just to give you an idea what the project does, we had the initial idea was actually, and that's 2019, to develop a kind of self-evaluation tool that somehow similar to Selfie or HI Innovate, which would help institutions to assess their digital education capacities and abilities. We thought this was a good idea. And in order to get this started, we conducted first a survey on digitally enhanced learning and teaching across Europe, where we asked a lot of questions and it generated a lot of data. Then we also put together, we started a desk research trying to find out on existing tools for digitally enhanced learning assessment. And then we came to realize that there are actually many existing. We sent you in preparation for this workshop the inventory report that we have put together. And as you saw there were around 30 tools included in the inventory report. At that moment, we reconsidered the purpose of our project, and we said it doesn't actually make sense to add yet another tool, but rather try to find out how the tools that already exist, how do they work and what do they actually achieve. And that's what we tried then to do in the project. And we came to realize that there is actually not much discussion and work, not so much discussion and work done around these instruments, that they are often not very strongly used. And so we were thinking on how we could have more peer exchange and peer learning and build a kind of community. And that brought us to these 2 cycles of virtual thematic peer groups on digitally enhanced learning and teaching. And the first cycle has already been conducted in last December. And the second cycle has just been started. And I will come back to that and tell you a little bit about this. The other measure that we took, and which focuses more on the self-reflection aspect, is that we developed a 3-part workshop series on self-reflection and self-assessment. And this workshop here is now the second one. And yeah, the last project output will then be a self-paced resource. So you can imagine it as a kind of MOOC on self-assessment, which we hope to launch in November this year. The next slide, please. I mentioned the survey that we conducted, and in the survey, we asked, among others, also a question on whether institutions actually undertake self-assessment or have conducted self-assessment, and whether they have been using self-assessment or benchmarking tools. And here you see the results. So it was at the time actually just 12% who had done that. And 43% said that they hadn't done that, but another 45% said that they hadn't done that and would be interested to try these out. So obviously limited uptake, but also quite some interest into the issue. The next one, please. And we asked you basically the same question. And here you can see who is actually here today. And if you look at the results that we got from you, well, the number is slightly higher. Now, it would be, I'm not sure if we can conclude from that the use of self-evaluation instruments has increased. It might be so. So 19% said that they used them actually. And we will be interested to discuss with you your experiences. And another 27% says that they haven't used them, but would be interested in. But again, we have, as for the survey that we conducted in early 2020, we have around of 50, more than 50% actually, who said that they haven't done that, either because they don't know about this or for other reasons. Next one. So by contrast, when we asked you, has your institution ever carried out an evaluation on its digital approach without using a self-assessment tool, there you see that's a completely different issue. There we find out that actually 90% has done that and only 10% not yet. So practically everybody carries out evaluations, but they do not use, institutions do not necessarily use self-assessment tools. And this will be one of the issues that we hope to explore a bit during this workshop here. The next one, please. We are coming now to our first big program point here. We have shared with you the videos from DCU and from Vitaurus Magnus University on their experience with self-evaluation and self-assessment and self-assessment tools. And we have Aisling and Lina here today. So here's the chance for you to ask them questions. We asked you actually, can you take presentation? We asked we asked you actually to send in your questions. So we received quite a few, and I will ask them here. But at the same time, if you have any further questions, you are happy to put them into the chat. Yeah, and then we will take them up from there. So One of the questions that has been asked, and I think that's a question to both of you, Aisling and Lena, is, I mean, how did you actually set up the self-assessment that you conducted? I mean, you both describe it a bit. You needed a group, which with colleagues from faculty, but also from the management of institution. So how have you done that, and how did you decide who is in and who is not? Aisling, do you want to start?
Sure. So I would say in relation to looking at digital learning at an institutional level, we were following an already quite established process for quality reviews within the institution itself. And generally those reviews are done of departments within the university, and every department has to get reviewed once every 7 years. But of course, this review was slightly different. It's not looking at an individual department, it's looking at a broad strategic theme. And for that reason, it was really important right from the outset that we established a number of things in relation to the review. The first was the terms of reference. The notion of digital learning is so huge and all embracing within the institution. So we needed to decide what problem were we trying to solve, what did we want to find out, and for what purpose. And so there were clear terms of reference developed. And then we set out to establish a steering group. And there were a number of principles to that steering group, which were important to us at the establishment. One was that the steering group would be, and I call it in very broad terms, academically led. So that there would have to be a large proportion of the review team which represented the academic interests of the institution. Everybody is interested in the academic aspects of the institution, but those who worked in academic units. And that there would also be senior academic leaders on the review panel. So first of all, the proportion of the review team that was dedicated to those academic voices was the predominant one. In relation, each faculty, and there are 5 at DCU, nominated an individual. Now, those individuals tended to have leadership responsibility or had leadership responsibility, either relating to the management of a school or a department, or had, I suppose, strategic oversight and responsibility for teaching and learning more generally within the faculty. And then there were 2 other key groups that were involved in the steering group. One was membership among the support units who had organizational responsibility for other areas of digital learning. So, for instance, our IT department in relation to the technology, our library, student support services, even how students were registered and interacted from a student records perspective were represented as well. And then lastly, another important element of the review team was the voice of students within the panel. And so there were 2 elected representatives, student representatives, who joined the steering group for the period of self-assessment.
Mm-hmm. If I can have a follow-up question on that, in your list of what you would do better in the next round, you mentioned you would involve more voices. I don't know if that was related to the self-evaluation group, or but somebody picked it up and asked, what do you mean by that?
Sure. So my comment on the voices related specifically to a specific element of self-reflection, which was the benchmarking piece. So, and I know you'll be discussing benchmarking tools later on this afternoon. So we had a number of different elements of self-reflection for which I think we had a broad range of voices. We conducted surveys, there were focus groups. And at the end of that process, we used a code benchmarking tool as a third tool of self-assessment. And what I would definitely do differently would be having more voices around the table for that particular element. It was at the end of our total self-assessment period. It was a relatively small group. And they were also a group of individuals who had a strong knowledge base of the breadth of digital learning activities within the institution. So the types of voices that I'm thinking of, if we were to do it again, would be academic practitioners who are perhaps non-enthusiasts when it comes to digital learning. I would involve staff who are much more embedded within schools, who perhaps don't have leadership positions. And this relates to an issue of communication, so that we could check the awareness of our policies and structures and tools in relation to digital learning. So non-enthusiasts and potentially more junior academic members of staff. I would open the breadth of student involvement to include both current and, if possible, alumni who have ended this stage of their student learning journey with DCU. And if possible, I think it would be very interesting to include external stakeholders. So graduate employers or work integrated learning employers who are interacting with our students, with collaborators or suppliers of our digital services, and with other kind of sectoral voices, potentially in other higher education institutions. It would be interesting to see what their perception is of our digital landscape and so on.
Thanks. Lena, how did this work at your institution? I mean, how did you get the team together and how did they work?
Well, at our university, so we have a regularly working group on distance and e-learning issues, and similarly, it's part of our quality assurance system. And this group is composed of representatives of the faculties and also international relations office, as they are also responsible for recruitment and communicating with our international students, and also representatives from our Students' Council. But in our case, we worked on a new strategy, on the new university strategy, and we worked last year, so in the middle of the pandemics. So a special group was composed, and actually very similar principles were applied for the composition of the group. Well, because, for example, students at our university, they are present in all of groups, and they are really very active, and they want their voice to be heard. Well, and more specifically, we used the DIGIHE as a framework. And we use this framework to make a SWOT analysis. Well, just also to decide what are our strategic goals and aims, which should be set in the new strategy. And of course, we have to admit that the pandemic situation well, actually stimulated some of the activities which probably would take more time for us to put in the strategy. So we worked very coherently analyzing what infrastructure we have, for example, and whether it's sufficient to reach the new goals we set to, for example, to have at least 10% of our study programs delivered as fully online. Or to reach other strategic indicators. So the same was, we analyzed whether our teacher competencies are sufficient and so on. So I think not going into details what we analyzed, but this diverse composition allowed us to look from different angles, and I think to set quite ambitious goals in the new strategy.
Yeah. You said actually in your presentation that it helped you to agree on direction to take, And could you give some of the examples of the strategic changes that you decided to take, to do?
Well, I think one very significant change we implemented is because our university is a liberal arts-based university. So it means that we have certain groups of study courses which are taken by all students, notwithstanding which study program they are studying in. So this usually we had like 800 students sitting in auditorium and listening and working with one teacher. So the strategic decision was to move these courses to fully online. And it solved us certain problems, as we have campuses in 2 cities, which are 100 kilometers distance. So it allowed us to equally offer for students, whether they are in Vilnius or in Kaunas, to choose the same courses and to have the same quality of studies, so notwithstanding the location. And also, I think one of the strategic goals was also to agree on the investments in infrastructure, and because somehow it was not so easy to convince the university administration to invest in infrastructure needed for online courses.
Interesting. And Aisling, you actually mentioned that it was probably not so much about getting a shared understanding, but about sharing understanding. Can you illustrate that a bit? I mean,
yeah, and I hope I'm answering your question. When we started this notion of doing a thematic review of digital learning, I think our goals and aims were very much focused on the strategic picture and tying it in with an agenda for quality enhancement. It included, the entire process included an element of external peer review, which is incredibly useful for us in terms of building recommendations for our future enhancement. However, what we didn't reckon on, and I think what happens in every good process of self-assessment, is that you're unearthing practice which has lived within faculties and schools, and really shedding light on those and enabling other colleagues to be able to be inspired, may be a strong word, but to certainly to have that good practice recognized and to start thinking about how that practice could work in other disciplinary contexts. And I think that was of particular value for us. We would say that the most valuable document created in the process of this quality review was the self-assessment report, because it not only pointed us or started discussions within the institution about where we wanted to go, but really was able to highlight quite innovative practice, very interesting practice, or indeed interesting disciplinary challenges around digital learning, which would have otherwise gone unsurfaced.
And did the AGOD benchmarking that helped to inform the self-evaluation?
Very much so. And I know I had mentioned about the inclusion of other voices. I think we do it differently and in a much more detailed way if we were doing it before. But there were really interesting conversations that were thrown up, really honest and self-critical conversations. And one of the most interesting things that would happen as we were discussing where to put ourselves on the score of particular benchmarks would be where we would say, we're a 2, but we should be a 4. That's the most interesting thing for me that could happen within the conversations, because you are already starting to think about where you want to go to as an institution. And so we would have had a lot of discussions around, is this a 3? Is it a 4? Nothing was a 5. A lot of the times, a 5 out of 5, but a lot of the times you would say, we're a 2 in this, and we really, really should be a 4. And I think that that's an important starting point for a discussion about where your priorities should be for the future.
And you mentioned it also that the important thing was actually not the score, but the rationale and the analysis around that that you exchanged. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And the notes that we would have taken that would have accompanied the rationale for that have been kind of vital for us. Absolutely.
Okay. Another question for both of you. So there is an institution which is just in the process of updating its digital strategy. Would you think that a self-assessment, institutional self-assessment, could help to do that? And if so, at what stage should you build it in? I don't know, Lina, you want to start it?
Right. I can only say from the experience of our university, and I think if you are in the process of revising your digitalization strategies, so it's really very useful not only, let's say, to maybe to see what are trends, what are perspectives, but really to critically assess where you are and where you want to be. So I would say it's really the beginning, the state at the beginning. You can really make a SWOT analysis or other type of analysis just to identify your strengths and how to build on them. And as well, I think it's these self-assessment tools also allow you to see, because you have to be quite coherent in all aspects. So you cannot only invest, let's say, in one area and expect that you are successful. So you should also formulating your let's say goals. You have to look at, for example, maybe we need to look more at the curriculum approaches. For example, in our case, we had really big challenge to convince teachers that working on e-learning platform and organizing assessment, you can use more tools than tests and so on. So it sometimes also requires to identify areas where you really have to work with in your community if you want to make further steps. So from my point of view, that would be really very useful to do it from the very beginning.
Okay, Aisling, any comments on this?
Yeah, I think in the context of developing a new strategy, self-assessment can obviously provide really useful information about where you are at as an institution. I can only really speak to the code benchmark that we used, although I know that there are so many other tools that are helpfully evaluated within the report that you'll discuss later on this afternoon. And that takes a standards-based approach to looking at digital learning. And if those standards or particular benchmark standards that are described within that benchmarking tool are particular strategic goals of your institution, I think it's a really interesting place to start. Maybe not look at all 8 benchmarks, but the ones that are particularly important or relevant to your specific context. I think just to mention 3 other things, there are natural tensions in doing this, particularly as it would relate to developing a digital strategy. And I think one of the tensions is whether we want to be technology-led in terms of the solutions or to be pedagogically led in terms of the teaching and learning, and where those 2 things meet. I think also in developing a digital strategy, there will be lots of discussions about academic autonomy and practitioner autonomy versus institutional alignment in relation to the use of digital technologies. And then also when in relation to our academic staff and the people who are engaging with digital technologies, you will have a tension between enthusiasts and non-enthusiasts for a whole variety of complex reasons, which will also be incorporated into that particular discussion.
So clear advice to look at the type of instruments that you choose and if this is something that aligns with what your institution actually wants to do. Probably related to that is that is there a way of how to modify the use of these tools and probably also just use it partially? I mean, what we found when we looked at them, it sometimes already starts with language, that you say, this is not the language that I want to use. You know, have you adapted them to your needs? Aisling and then Lina.
I'm happy to start.
Yeah.
Use the digital tools as they were.
Okay.
In terms of a code, and I would just note again that the individuals who were involved in that particular exercise would have been very familiar with the language of both institutional strategy, quality enhancement, and digital learning. So this would have been an environment that was familiar to them in this case, but I certainly see merit in being able to take the broad principle, but to use a tool in a way that is context specific.
Mm-hmm. And Lina?
Well, in most cases, tools are quite universal. And well, it depends what your needs are. There was one question whether we should take into account the maybe specifics of the university, if you have some maybe
Indeed.
specifics profile, or you are smaller or bigger and so on. Well, so I would say that you can use this tool both ways. And actually, if you can use them as they are and without any modifications, but definitely you can modify if, let's say, if it doesn't work particularly for some areas for your university. So, from my point of view, everything depends on what are your goals and what you want to do with this tool. So, if you want to have like more panoramic picture, so probably it's one way, but if you are more interested in one specific area, maybe you can work more on that. So I would say so.
Yeah, okay. Then I take also the opportunity and answer one question that we had in the chat from Maria Ranieri. Maria, just to clarify, we're not talking about one self-assessment tool, but DCU and VMU use different ones. And we have actually this report which tries to assess them. We do not necessarily compare them all, but I mean, we try to provide a bit of consumer advice there and show you what you can do with them and what you might need another tool. One question that is, I think, very important, you point to that this takes resources when you want to conduct a self-evaluation and use a self-evaluation tool properly, you know. Can you say something about that in terms of people, time, money? Lina.
Yes, of course it takes, I think, the main resource is time, and but at the same time it's motivating, and I think one group, as in our case, for example, the group which works on the new strategy, it's a temporal group, so the work is done and so on, but this regularly working group, so it's continuous work, and it's part of, for example, the activities of our Institute of Innovative Studies, and they are regularly conducting quality assurance and kind of small self-assessment reports. What I think is also important that when you make the decision what kind of tool you are using, so probably also to be consistent later on in your later stages of your quality assurance processes and your self-evaluation practices, not to jump from one tool to another, and so to be consistent on all levels, on the whole institutional, on the faculty level, and also on the program level. So then it allows you really to monitor the progress and to see where you are and so on. So we did this way, and actually when the strategy strategy based on this self-assessment report was developed and approved. So all faculties, we worked and we discussed, and we also planned what we should do on the level of our, let's say, faculty or academy.
Mm-hmm. So you would not change the tool. If you would do it again, you would use the same tool again?
Well, so far we were quite happy with the tool. So, but of course, you all the time you are looking what tools are available. But from my point of view, maybe you still have to be quite consistent, at least for the period for the implementation of your strategy, because otherwise it might be complicated to achieve what you plan to achieve.
Mm-hmm. Any comment on that?
Yes, in terms of resources and costs, the key one was time. Okay. The cost being the opportunity cost that we didn't do other things on. The only other external cost was that we conducted focus groups, and we had those externally facilitated. So there was a small cost in relation to an external facilitator. If you were to use a benchmark tool as part of your self-assessment, and I see Natasha has mentioned in the comments, I should note that we use the A-code benchmark tool. It's in the report that you'll talk about later on, but I'll put a URL link to it as well. That is a tool that can be entirely internally led in terms of the investment of time among your staff and students. But it could also be something that the discussions are externally facilitated by an independent facilitator, and that may be useful as well. So, but for us, it was largely about time. I would say that there was an enormous payback in terms of the benefit of the investment of that time. For all of those involved, not only the academic staff in terms of the unearthing of practice, the raising of issues, but also a really important opportunity for lots of people who are working in digital learning to really build great professional relationships that were now based much more on trust than they had been previously. So you're building, I suppose, collaboration and collegiality among colleagues as well. So that was a benefit of all of our investment.
So very important, it's not about the findings, or not only about the findings, it's really about the process, make that participatory and get, as Lina had already said, get your institution behind what you try to do. Yeah, okay, very good. So if you would do it again, would you use a different tool or anything? Yeah.
I really like the tool without having,
okay.
It's kind of like going to a restaurant and immediately you order a dinner.
My favorite dish, yeah.
Really like, and then never try anything else because that one has worked for you. Okay. What I would say is the self-assessment tools that we use, the A-code tool, only formed part of our entire self-assessment. So, and if we were doing it again, I would use the tool, but I would use it much more deeply. And I wouldn't try to rush through all of the 8 benchmarks with all of the same group of people. I would certainly layer it a lot more with key stakeholders, enabling and almost provoking dissenting voices as part of the discussions as well, because I think the standards themselves were very interesting. They were very relevant, but they needed a lot of teasing through.
Yeah, in the chat, Alistair proposes that it's not about the tool, it's about it's the process, and that I think indeed, yeah, that might sum it up. So how much time should you allocate for the process, the way how you conducted it?
Our process was around 6 months, although we had some data hanging around from surveys that we were able to leverage. But there is a case for spending 6 months on the benchmarking tool alone over a period of time with different stakeholders. So I think that a lot of it will be down to individual institutions and the extent to which they have time and resources to be able to invest in this.
And ideally, you do that not in COVID pandemic times, but in a more normal situation. Lina, how long did it take you, or how long do you think one should allocate?
Well,
for
it's
such a
really
process?
very similar. It's more or less half a year. And
Okay.
of course, it's also reviewing, let's say, yearly reports you have, and it's not only focusing on that. But maybe also answering the question whether would you use the same tool, I could say that we heard from other colleagues, let's say other universities, other schools, even we are collaborating. For example, DIGIHE.org was maybe too generic for some of them, and they wanted maybe more specific looking, let's say, at some areas to go deeper. So actually it might depend on your needs, but we were quite happy because I think for the strategic level, you have to look at all components. Later on, you might maybe add extra tools if you find them useful.
Well, thanks so much once again for your presentations to allow us to reuse them. That's really great. And also for answering so candidly all these questions. So I hand back now to, is it to Alison or to Irina? To Irina, I think. Thanks.
Yeah. Thanks so much, Michael, and to Aisling and Lina. Yeah, so we're right on time. That was very punctual, Michael. We will move on to the next program item, which indeed is by another member of VMU who's also taking part in the DIGI-HE project. So Irina, if you want to take the floor, and Irina is going to present one of the project's main deliverables to you now, which is our inventory report of self-assessment instruments called Developing a High-Performance Digital Education Ecosystem. So Irina, over to you.
Yes, indeed, dear participants, dear colleagues, I will answer some of your questions that I have followed in the chat, because as Alison said, we are going to present now the report on self-assessment instruments. And I also gave to you the link in the chat a little bit earlier to the EUA website where the resource is available, but also I saw that you received it as preparatory material for this workshop. So could you please help me with the slides? And the following slides will shortly introduce to you the inventory of self-assessment instruments for digitally enhanced learning and teaching. We call it Developing a High-Performance Digital Education Ecosystem. And that is not in vain. We could not realize in 2019, when we started the activities in order to prepare and produce this report, that this report might be of such use to higher education institutions, even considering the need to have this coherent and overlooking approach to self-assessment. Why? Because it happened that in post-pandemic period, we saw that the majority of education institutions, including higher education institutions, moved, of course, due to the lack of time, very spontaneously, but also fragmentally online, using available tools and resources so that they would be able to continue with academic processes. Unfortunately, time did not allow higher education institutions to take into consideration all the areas that academic activities actually are influenced upon. So the purpose of this report was to review existing self-assessment instruments that would allow institutions to assess their state of play in respect of digitally enhanced learning and teaching through the years, through the decades before a pandemic. And we came up with a new actually impact that is very important today. Next slide, please. In this desk research, you will find the review of 23 instruments. Finally came up as a result 20 instruments only, and the instruments were analyzed through the point of view of the type of the instrument. Is it a tool? Is it a framework? Or maybe a combination of both? And the reference that you heard from Vytautas Magnus University, DIGIHE.org, is the framework. Actually, DIGIHE.org, as an example, was the framework that selfie instrument was based upon. But then, as you saw, it is possible to apply a framework also for other levels of education. The same with the DISC, Digitally Capable Organization Framework, also European Maturity Model for Blended Education, with the acronym EMBED, NCAM, Quality Assurance of E-Learning Provision, National Quality Standards for Online Education, 3E Framework. So the frameworks that are available for application as tools and instruments. There were some tools reviewed like Selfie or HE Innovate, but also a combination of tool and framework like a UNESCO blended learning assessment tool, JISC tools, e-excellence tools, and other tools as well. So we looked at the through this analysis whether what kind of type of instrument it is, or who was the creator behind, when the instrument was launched, in which languages it is or was available, the target group, the implementation status, or maybe there is a community behind the tool, examples of use and application, theoretical perspective taken, and also links to instruments and instructions. Each tool has been reviewed, as you can see in the slide, by two reviewers. And also in the end, we tried to establish some strengths and limitations, which are available in the format of templates at the end of the desk research report. Next slide, please. So when we are discussing what are self-instruments for and when we can use them, so the best example might be coming from the need of a higher education institution and the community within the institution in order to find the common language and understanding what is the impact of integration of digitally enhanced learning and teaching in an organization. It cannot be only infrastructure, it cannot be only curriculum or assessment, staff or student support. It should go through all the areas affected by digitally enhanced learning and teaching or integration of technologies into an organization. So first of all, to understand the overall areas affected by digitalization. And actually it goes throughout of self-assessment that is common for higher education institutions. The other purpose is to collect data, to collect evidence, to share ideas, concerns, lessons learned, to introduce new areas, as we just heard from the discussion, that are very specific and important areas for a definite organization. And then to facilitate structured conversations, to continue with annual maybe revision of practices. And we of course know from our webinars and from other events in Europe and on the global space that there exist good practices. So maybe institutions, especially in the international settings, might be inviting people for sharing the understanding the practices and the best practices as well. And then, of course, depending on the purpose and the nature of the instrument, it really depends a lot upon the instrument that you choose. So maybe you would like to choose the instrument that would cover the broadest area of institutional activity areas, but maybe you want to go deeper. And for example, if you choose only curriculum area and you want to go deeper into it, there exist also other instruments that assess the quality of curriculum on a course level. But this is a little bit out of the scope of this report. Next slide, please. And then we, of course, also discussed on how to select the right instrument. And also this is the continuation of the discussion that we just heard between Aisling and Lina. Here are the same maybe answers that were asked during discussion. Some of them are repeated here in the slides, but that is why it's a good idea to consider pick and mix approach, so that if you identify some areas that could be, let's say, addressed in a more specific way, just like I mentioned with the curriculum assessment on the course level, it might be useful also to integrate new instruments, not only from institutional assessment, but also other instruments like quality assurance on course level, or for digitally competent teachers and students from DIGICOM Edu as an example. Next slide, please. So how to use these instruments in your institution? We also heard already some recommendations. My recommendation, as I was one of the co-authors of this desk research, I would advise you to investigate the annexes that are provided in the desk research. Look through the tables that provide to you information on the strengths and weaknesses of the instruments that our peer reviews established. Then maybe consult your community, the group that is implementing self-assessment, which specifically instrument to apply, and then whether it is sufficient for you, or maybe how you're going to deviate from the instrument, and then thoroughly plan and promote the exercise. From the experiences that we heard, it is time-consuming, but at the same time, it is very useful to agree internally within the institution what are your aims and what is the outcome that you want to achieve, the answers to the statements within the instrument, or maybe the SWOT, the strengths, the weaknesses, opportunities, and threats that you're going to identify. So you are absolutely, of course, free to choose your own path on how to use the instrument within your institution. And I hope that is more or less all information from the desk research report that you, of course, are also able to download from the website. And I hope you already have done that and already had a short look at it. Some of the instruments might be, of course, better to use as they stand, because they also provide the possibility to extract results in the form of the diagram, or let's say another digital visualization for your own institution, so that you can work on them as you decide. So that is all from me, just in 10 minutes to give you a very short overview on this desk research. Maybe you have some questions that I can also answer.
Thank you so much, Irina, for your presentation of the report. Yes, as Irina said, please feel free to ask Irina some questions now. You can either just put your hand up if you wish, or you can put your question in the chat box. And I see that we have our first one from Alistair, so I'll let Irina take that up.
I think Alistair is right, asking about the barrier, like too many tools to select. I am confident that each of you representing now higher education institution here in this room might have one or another expert from your institution in the area of digitally enhanced learning and teaching that you might want to ask for a recommendation that maybe could be useful for your group. And I'm sure people working in the area might recognize very quickly the instruments that would lead more or less to internal exercise. Others might be leading to better benchmarking of the institution, while other instruments would also be very helpful as theoretical references and frameworks. And of course, this is also in line and maybe to discuss with the researchers working within an institution. For example, we at Vytautas Magnus University selected the tool that was closest tool to our developments in the application of technologies in higher education in our online studies through a decade. So you know, I don't think this is a barrier, but rather a menu. And of course, if you are really lost at it, I think it would be very useful to find some people working in the area for longer time so that they can help you.
Are there any other questions for Irina? Again, please feel free just to put your hand up or to put your question in the chat box as you wish. We have a question from Maria. Please,
Yeah.
Maria, go ahead.
So first of all, thank you everybody for this interesting workshop. I was curious about the impact of the responsible of the administration of the tool. You said that one of the factor which influence actually the delivery of the tool is who is the owner of the responsible for the process. Because if I understand, the characteristics or the responsibilities of the identity of the administrator of the responsible of the process will influence the choice of the tool. You have shown different tools and frameworks, and this can generate confusion, as Alastair said. But I also think that this multiplication of tools also is linked to the point of view of the responsible for the process of self-assessment. So what kind of relationship more deeply you have identified between the responsible of the process and the choice of the tool?
I must tell you that not all of the tools are online tools. Some of them are downloadable, so that you can have the form you can have them in the format of statements linked, let's say, to certain areas of institutional academic activities like leadership and management, curriculum development, program development, or infrastructure, etc., etc. So you might download the set of statements and use them offline, so to say, with your team that is implementing institutional self-assessment. There are other tools that are available online, and you fill in the data directly into the instrument. And then the dependence, as you say, with the administrator, or let's say the author, the creator of the tool, is in a more, so to say, depending more on the author of the tool. So you submit the data, and then you get the visualization or the response from the tool. Did I answer your question?
From a certain point of view, yes. You clarified an important aspect linked to the property of the data as well, probably. And we can go also deeper, I think, from this point of view.
Exactly.
Okay, that's fine. I was also wondering about the responsible of the choice of the tool. I mean, if we work in group, that's fine, but as emerged even from previous interventions, sometimes the emphasis can be put more on the technical aspects, other times on the pedagogical ones. So, I mean, there are actually several problems which must be considered at the beginning of the process, which are linked to technical aspect with political consequences, but also to the type of framework that we choose, more pedagogically oriented, more organizational oriented, more technological oriented. However, thank you very much. Very interesting.
Thanks, Maria. Michael, I see you have your hand up as well.
Yeah, I think just to follow up on that, I think that's the point that we try to make in the report, you know, and it came also out quite clearly from the two colleagues who tried to work with tools at their institutions. So it is a decision that you have to make. And I think it's right. You can't use several tools at the same time. Aisling also made the point that you might think of how to complement them and what to build in addition to it. I think that's an important point. And just to follow up on what Alistair wrote there, the large number of tools, indeed, and this was the situation that we had to face in our first project year. We had thought we knew about a few tools, and we thought maybe we can do better and design a tool that is good for the European higher education area, and that could provide some commonality and a common use and way of working together between institutions on digital developments. But I think when we saw on how many are out there and had difficulties to make out clear communities of users, we somehow thought this might not be the way of how this works, and we are still trying to somehow to find out what is the issue there, because we can understand, of course, that there are arguments pro certain tools and also against certain tools. You might like this or that. But generally, we would think it could be at least useful to look at them and consider the questions that are asked there before you engage in any kind of self-assessment on digital enhanced learning. As you read in the report, most of them are done quite diligently. So a lot of work and thinking went into that. And that could be, even if you don't want to use them in the end, you know, it could be a good starting point for your own self-assessment or self-evaluation.
Thanks, Michael. And I think we have one more question in the chat from Sandra. Irina, if you want to pick that up.
Yes, I think it's a very good question, because actually self-assessment is not only the challenge for the group that is implementing self-assessment in terms of time, resources, and other things, but for the higher education institution, and not only having impact upon whether everything, let's say, will be addressed that has been identified. The community develops a lot through the process of implementation of self-assessment. They reach common understanding, they develop their understanding together, they reach out for completely new, let's say, levels of seeing of the impact that technologies can have upon different areas of academic activities. And then there is a challenge for the institution, which and how and when challenges to address and to put into the strategy. And I think then the people who are behind the higher education institution, they also are looking around how higher education institutions put the programs, strategies in place Also which higher education institution puts more weight on infrastructure or on human capital development, on digital competence development, on program development, on flexibility of the programs, and many other aspects. So it's not an easy question to say what happens with the results. Definitely not all the weaknesses highlighted by the instrument or through the discussions of the self-assessment group can be addressed immediately, but I think the priorities is a very prioritization of the further actions is a very important step taken by higher education institutions.
Thanks so much, Irina, and that's perfect. It's now 3:10, which is yes, exactly when we should be moving on to our next program item. So thank you so much for that. We are now going to talk about another project activity, which are the thematic peer groups being organised within the framework of the DIGI-HE project as well. So I'm going to hand the floor back to Michael Gable, who's going to tell you a little bit about 3 reports that we have just published from these thematic peer groups. So over to you, Michael.
Yeah, thanks. And I mean, it relates, of course, to assessment, self-assessment, self-reflection, and 3 important topics that we identified in 2020, also from the survey report that we did. And these were strategy and organizational culture, curriculum assessment, and international partnerships. So these 3 turned out in a question in our survey questionnaire of what institution, where institutions wanted to move forward as areas of strategic development. And can I have the next slide, please? And we did this, we did address this through thematic peer groups. Now, this is a format that UA developed some years ago, and by now we have managed to put that on fully online. And how it works is basically we launch a call for participation of institutional leadership in these thematic peer groups. We usually invite people who are responsible, who have strategic responsible for learning and teaching, which could be a vice rector, which could be the head of a learning and teaching center, these kind of profiles. And then we bring them together in a series of meetings in the times when these groups met physically. These were usually 3 meetings over about a year's time. We now do that through more frequent online meetings. And what they do is actually they work on a particular topic and discuss with each other and try to find out what are their successful or promising practices, but also what are the challenges that they see at their institution. And then they reflect on that and they come up with recommendations, generally for the institutions, but sometimes also for policymakers. And in the last series of report that we did, there was also one for EdTech industry, very timely. And this results then into little outcome reports, and the results are also presented at our annual learning and teaching forum that takes place every year in February. The next one will take place in Bilbao in February 2023. And well, as you see it here, it's really a kind of bottom-up approach. So we are, while we not exclude the use of literature, we really try to capture the experience that people have at their institution. And as these groups are very diverse in terms of the different institutions that are different types of institutions that are involved, and also as people come from different countries, it gives you a really broad range of experience. And the whole initiative also contributes to community building. Many of the colleagues, they stay in touch and exchange and also get involved in joint programs and all kinds of things. So I really encourage you to join us. We will launch late this autumn a call for the 2023-2024 groups. Yes, the next slide, please. So the first cycle of TPGs that we ran from March to December 2021 were about these three topics: strategy and organizational culture, curriculum assessment, and international partnerships. And as I said already, they were mainly chosen that because we found out in our survey that people and strategy, they were the key for success. They were mentioned as key for success to digitally enhanced learning and teaching at institutions. And also that digitally enhanced learning was at that time only roughly used by half of the institutions in a mainstreamed way, and that also we learned that there was need for further pushes in curriculum development, and also for digital assessment turned out to be a topic of that received great interest. And then on a more positive note, there was also the expectation by the majority of the institution that, first of all, they had made some positive experience with digital ways of internationally exchanging and collaborating, but they also expected that this would play a bigger role in the future. So clearly set to enhance this and to improve it. Can I have the next one, please? Next one. So to share some key findings from the TPGs that we had, there was, as I'm sure you will all agree, that the COVID-19 experience offered some valuable lessons for the further development of digitally enhanced learning and teaching. And under the impact of the crisis, the majority of the participants agreed that there should be more focused on digitally enhanced learning and teaching that is flexible, inclusive, equitable, and also student-centered. I think this is important that also with regards to the cultural change that it needs at the institution. And we see that it really as a clear quality development compared to how digital enhanced learning has discussed often in the past, where the focus was strongly on technical points, technical infrastructure, whereas we can see now its focus is much more on the institutional culture and really try to find out what is the added value and somehow also bring it forward. And one of the recommendations that has been made is to recognize and to celebrate early adopters and their contribution to the transformation that takes place in the institution. Another clear point that came out from all three groups was that it needs collaborative or participatory approaches if you want to make forward. And I think that has been emphasized several times this afternoon already. So you have to involve staff and students and stakeholders. Otherwise, you might just drive it into a wall. So this should not be experienced as a top-down approach. You have to get them involved. And one of the recommendations was to develop means for co-governance and co-creation to ensure that the members of the institution, staff and students take over ownership. And this was also seen as one of the ways to avoid or to mitigate the guideline fatigue and get more acceptance for digital ways. And the last point that we want to make here is that it needs adequate support for staff and students in order to succeed. And you also have to keep enough scope for experimentation and innovation in digital education in order to ensure that this can be developed further. And recommended where here's training opportunities, validation of educators, digital skills, but also to build and nurture these communities of practices, which allows staff, but also students to exchange with each other and learn from each other, and also helps, of course, to disseminate then good practice. Next slide, please. All three TPGs referenced also the importance of self-assessment. I'm not going to read this out here. I just wanted to point to that. You find that in the reports that we sent also to you. And the next slide, please. And I come now to the self-assessment instrument part. So while we haven't really used self-assessment instruments in the TPGs, we thought we might want to look at the three topics that have been addressed in the report from the perspective of a self-assessment instrument. And the one that we have proposed here is the DIGI-Comp-Org framework, and we have taken out those questions that actually deal with leadership and governances, content and curricula, and then also with international collaboration and networking. We had to tweak them a little bit, but they are almost the same. And if I could have the next one, almost the same as in the original DIGI-HE. So here, these are the leadership and governance practices. I'm not going to present them in all detail here as they have been sent to you. And then if I could have the next two slides, this is the one for content and curricula. And we linked it, of course, to assessment practices. And the next one, the one on collaboration and networking. And I think that was what I know, I have a few slides more. Can I get the next one? Before we go in the breakout groups where we can discuss the DIGI-Com in more detail and also link it to the themes that you have chosen, I just wanted to share here some points from the little survey that we sent around to you so that you know a bit who is here in the room. So an interesting point here that 88% said that they have an international, an institutional strategy and a vision that encompasses digitally enhanced learning and teaching. But as you can see here, it's about half, 41% that says yes, and then 47% that says yes to some extent. So that clearly shows that there is some scope for enhancement. And also 70% of you said that they have or 2/3 said that they have an implementation plan for digitally enhanced learning, and also 70% said that they regularly assess the plan's implementation, and that they are at about half of this that they address concrete barriers and challenges in this assessment. Next slide, please. And here are some more findings from the pre-survey. 80% foresee now student assessment approaches have been reconsidered. 47% indicate that staff and students collaborate in curriculum design to create digital content. And 63% also mentioned that the institutional plan addresses issues of governance and management linked to digitally enhanced learning and teaching. And also 54% that there are opportunities of digitally enhanced learning and teaching that they are used in international exchange and collaboration. So all areas probably where you made quite some progress, also due to the COVID crisis over the past years. And yeah, I think that's what I wanted to share here. And then I think, Alison, we are good then to go into the breakout groups.
Everyone, we are back to the main groups after hard work in the groups. So let me see if we are all here. Okay, so what is now planned is that we have reports from the groups. We had 3 peer group. Let me see. Is there any volunteers to start sharing some reflections from the group work? I don't know who chaired the first group, strategy, organizational culture, who was chairing this group, and do you have any volunteer to come with some recommendation or some?
Yes. So I'm Lene Peterba from EUA, European University Association. I facilitated the discussions, and I can briefly report back on what we learned. So we talked about whether group members did have a strategy at their institution for digitally enhanced learning and teaching, or whether digitally enhanced learning and teaching was embedded in the institutional strategy. And it seems like the latter was rather the case. Those institutions that do have something integrated in the strategy on digitally enhanced learning and teaching would rather have it embedded in their overall strategy, and then maybe a separate chapter on digitally enhanced learning and teaching, or DELT, instead of having a separate strategy altogether for digitally enhanced learning and teaching. But some institutions in the group also reported that they pre-COVID did not have a strategy and are still working out on developing such a strategy or a chapter in the overall institutional strategy as a response to COVID. What we also discussed was self-assessment culture or self-audit culture, how often this is conducted. And the overall impression was that self-assessment as part of regular internal and external quality assurance processes were very common. And usually they consist of an internal self-assessment process, but then also an external assessment process. And then usually, especially in the last 2 years, digitally enhanced learning and teaching would be addressed. But in terms of the big self-assessment process as described by the self-assessment tools we discussed before breaking up into groups, there was very little experience with these kinds of processes. But there was some interest in these kinds of tools, and there were certainly some group members that were looking into various tools and actually raised the question how to choose the right tool that is right for you. And one group member mentioned in particular that one useful approach might be to go for evidence-based approaches to self-assessment. So is there any evidence for any of these tools that they actually work and that they are helpful? So this kind of information would be useful in finding out which of the tools could be potentially practical and handy for an institution. This last point was also connected with comments about the DIGIHE framework, which was generally found to be interesting and useful, but perhaps a little bit too generic for universities in particular, because, for example, it does not address research or maybe also some other very university-specific missions or activities. So perhaps it is not specific enough for a university context. And finally, we also talked about the big challenges. We didn't manage to talk about goals, but the big challenges ahead for 2022-23 in terms of DELT, which are student assessment, student examination in a hybrid environment, how to actually do that in a meaningful way, student and staff well-being, but also how to support teachers best in encouraging to try out and get motivated and enthusiastic about blended learning provision, and how to move towards a more hybrid education provision, how to make this happen.
Yeah, thank you. Just a few comments to summarize the strategy. First one, the strategy. Actually, this is that would be my question to all the audience. Do we need to? Is it better to have one strategy that comprises all issues, or like digital education part, use of digital technologies, or is it better to have, for example, additional strategy on e-learning or use of ICT, on quality, on I don't know any other other issues. So what would be some of your thoughts regarding this issue of the strategy? So one strategy that has everything, or besides the main strategy, to have also the strategy for some special additional parts that contribute to the main strategy. What do you think? It would be good to hear the colleagues from other groups about that, their thinking about this issue. Sometimes, you know, when people write the strategy for example, e-learning or use of digital technologies, that strategy is not always so well linked to the main strategy. You know, they're always taken as a two separate things, you know, and sometimes people just look at the big one, the strategy of the institution as such, and this is like a separate thing. Yeah, I agree, Alistair. Today, I think digital is a part of everything. So let's not divide just digital in one part. But Alison, yes, you have raised the hand.
Yes, it's just to actually report back on behalf of my group on this very point, because I was in the group on international partnerships, and in general, internationalization strategies and digitalization strategies tended to be separate, and sometimes they found that this could lead to a lack of motivation if there was no connection between the two whatsoever. So that's just a comment from my group.
Yeah, thank you. Any other comments on this? Okay, so maybe later. The other point from the first group, I think, is a very good. We didn't have a strategy for COVID, but we were able to go through that. I think this is pure resilience, and this is something which is not long term. But I'm happy to hear your thoughts about that. Whilst you're thinking about this, I'm certain that all of you have done some surveys and researches during the pandemic about how teachers and students feel about the pandemic and the learning fully online. So did some of the results you have integrated into your strategies already, or what are these results should be used for? This is a question to all of you. I'm certain that you did a number of surveys with students and teachers. So based on the results from these surveys, what do you plan with them? Are they going to be integrated in the strategies of institutions, or in the strategy of quality assurance, or maybe e-learning strategy, or some?
I can say, if I may. So we discussed in our group that, and I said what we did, the surveys of students. And what we did, first of all, these surveys were used for the immediate reaction. What is necessary to change, what is necessary to update, what is necessary to improve immediately. Talking about the strategies, you know, strategies are developed for long terms, and to be honest, we didn't consider about it, but the main purpose of this surveys was to react immediately and improve the quality of teaching, learning, and assessment, digital online teaching, learning, and assessment at the moment and for the future.
Yeah, I agree with you. This was for the first moment, but now after 2 years, we have gained some significant experience, and these results are showing in which direction should we move. So basically, after the first task to save the education as such and to enable that it goes on, I think that some of the issues should be integrated into the strategies. Michael, you have raised the hand.
Yeah, and I think I follow up on what Inga said, because she was in my group, so I can report from my group. And I salute to Helene's report, because she really managed to keep the groups on the questions. I failed completely in this regards, but I think what I have to share is nevertheless interesting and complements her results. I think we all agreed that digital is no longer the question. So I think also many of the technical problems have been solved, and we are more now looking at what are we actually doing and why do we do this? And I think, Sandra, the problem that is at the moment, at least in my group, that became quite obvious, that all is a bit in limbo. So we are moving basically from a period where digital was default, so you had to either do it online or at least blended. And now we are going, basically, we have options suddenly. We can go back to campus, and that changes completely the situation. So there are choices to be made, and that also impacts curriculum and assessment, where some developments took place at institutions. In particular, assessment has been a key topic. But at the institutions, how it looked at the moment in my group there, it's between recorded lectures, which are not very popular with students, but also attempts then to facilitate hybrid learning, which was found quite complicated and cannot be seen as something that could be just outrolled throughout the institution. You really have to find out what this is actually good for. And I think behind this is the question, why do you meet at all, if you're just looking at each other on screens? So why do you gather? What do you do together? And what is the right means there? What is helpful at some institutions is that the digital also, without conducting much assessment, you see actually the student behavior also reflected in their digital uses. For example, who clicks the lectures? Are they actually watched? And if they are not, why do you actually produce them? So what still has to be done is the revision of the curricula and the assessment. But then it brings really up the question, for what situation do we actually do that? So I think it's the question, how do you best teach and learn? But also increasingly, how do we want to teach and learn? As we get a very diverse picture of whether and at what conditions staff and students want to go back to the institutions. It was interesting because that contrasted a bit of what we heard during the pandemic, when it seemed that everybody's craving to go back. But at least in some institutions, that's just much more hesitant. It's a very diverse picture. From one institution, we heard that undergraduates want to go back, but the graduates actually, they prefer to do that online or in hybrid approaches, which gives them more flexibility. And that brings then up also the question of assessment. Of course, you have to assess this situation and to explore actually what you're doing and how successful that is. But it might not necessarily be a good situation for a big 360 degrees assessment, as we heard it earlier this afternoon from the 2 institutional case studies. As everything is so much in development, probably it's more important to find out how specific practices, how they actually work, how they are accepted by teachers and learners, and take it on from there and try to build it up. So in a way, we have, similar as at the start of the COVID crisis, we are now again back at square one, and have to build it up from there.
Yeah, thank you, Michael. But let's see, there is really significant correlation between curriculum and strategies. If you want now to change curricula, and to make it to use more digital technologies, then you have to have this into the strategy as well. You know, I think one without other is not possible. So there is significant impact from the strategy point to curriculum. And
I understand that, Sandra, but I think it's exactly this point, you know, what is the purpose? And I think use more digital. This is probably not the purpose.
No,
so the question
I agree,
is,
but you know, as you have to accreditate the study programs, and you cannot do it just, you know, out of the like this, you know, you have to have some rules, and mainly there's a institution strategy in which direction they want to go, and according to that, the study programs are then prepared and accredited, you know.
Absolutely. I just wanted to make the point that it's not so clear what institutions, what direction institutions actually want to take at this point. You know, it's not like we walk out of the crisis and now we all have the blueprint, the master plan of how our learning and teaching should look like in the future. That seems not to be the case, at least in my group. It was not so clear.
Okay, I see Inga has raised the hand. So Inga, please, you want to add something?
Yes, I would like to follow your question. So I just thought, open your question, what lessons were learned by us during this pandemic period. And I completely agree, fully agree with you that we have to integrate a lot into our strategies. Because digital higher education now is a new normal, and it will be new normal. And I would say that the main takeaway from this period, and particularly from the feedback of students and of course teaching staff, is that we must invest in the training of teaching staff. And that means we must review and upgrade teaching, learning, and assessment methods and strategies, and which must be embedded into curricula. That means, so overall, we have to review the all curricula. And I think that we will include this into our strategy. But the question is, as it was said by Alastair again, not said, but wrote, is a question of resources. It costs a lot. So that's why universities must prioritize strategic goals, what is the most important, and because strategy without resources, strategy without budget is not possible to be implemented. Thank you.
Yeah, okay, I agree. And yes, Helena said also we need to focus on the pedagogical aspects, and not technology was something which we focused for the first 2 years because we have to find out how to continue, but now we have to move back. And this is why training of teachers is important, so that they know how to integrate digital technologies into educational process. Okay, let's hear from the last group. Alison, you were the leader of this group, so can you report what was, this group was on internationalization partnership. So Alison, please.
Yes, sure. Very briefly from me. So my group didn't have too much experience with self-assessment tools. However, they were interested in using them potentially in the future, and especially in the benchmarking aspect of self-assessment and comparing results potentially with other local institutions, specifically on the topic of internationalization. As I said previously, most people in the group had a strategy for internationalization. However, it tended to be a separate strategy from digitalization, and this resulted maybe there being a lack of motivation in a way, which is something that I mentioned earlier. The group agreed on some key challenges. Again, like what's been mentioned by the others, competences and skills really were key challenges here when it comes to internationalization. So having the skills to be able to conduct classes online, but also intercultural competences for dealing with students from all over the world. Furthermore, another challenge is non-academic staff and how to get them involved in international partnerships, as often they don't see the benefit, or they're simply not in a position to be able to travel. We also discussed some major plans for the future. So alliances were a major plan, so getting involved in university alliances or other networks involving associations. Virtual mobility as well was a major plan, as was adapting the curriculum for virtual mobility. Then in terms of getting more institutional staff involved in international partnerships, it was felt that more self-awareness or awareness raising was needed to highlight the benefits of it, or investing in more internationalization at home activities. And then another interesting plan that was mentioned, or more of a suggestion, was having more student-teacher partnerships in the future with an international dimension, as this tends to be just for students or just for teachers at the moment. So the idea to merge them. Yes, and yeah, that's just a summary.
Thank you. Thank you. Maybe someone from any group would like to add something which we maybe missed or should be emphasized a little bit more. I'm going back now to these surveys which has been done at the institution, but they could serve as well as a very good self-assessment instrument, because this was the answers of the students and on teachers how the institution did in the time of pandemic. So it would be a pity that these tool actually is left, beside and not used in strategy planning, in further actions which will be done because within the self-assessment which institution takes, so they can be also addition to that. Also, we saw that there is overlapping with strategy and curricula and any actions which are going to be taken, regarding the finances, which are very important. So if you need an infrastructure, if you need teacher training, if you need the training of non-academic staff, as you said, internationalization issues also requires some budget, although we can do virtual mobility or things like that, but it's not the only thing. So I think very valuable feedback from all the group. I will now go back to Alison to make some conclusions and wrap up this session. It has passed very quickly. I cannot imagine that it's already almost 2.5 hours. I thought that we have more time, but Alison, please.
Yes, thank you so much, Sandra, for moderating the plenary session. Gemma, if I could just ask you to put the presentation up again, please. It's the last slide. Yeah, so we just wanted to wrap up, and first of all, thank you for attending the workshop. It was great to hear from so many of you and that you were so active in all the discussions. So a recording of the event will be shared with you if you would like to watch it again, and it will also be shared with those who could not attend today. So if you wouldn't mind, we would really like to hear your feedback on the event, and we're just going to put a link to a survey in the chat, which we would like you to fill out, and it'll only take maximum 3 minutes. So my colleague will put that in the chat for you in just a moment before we finish up. And then the next slide, please, Gemma. Yeah, so some upcoming events then. So as we said at the beginning of the workshop, it's actually a 3-part workshop series. So this is the second, and there will be a third one taking place in the autumn. So we will let you know about that nearer the time. As Michael mentioned as well, a part of the DIGIHE project is is actually the development of a self-paced training digital resource on institutional self-assessment. So that will be launched in November 2022. And there is another round of TPGs currently taking place, and they will be concluded at the European Learning and Teaching Forum next year in Bilbao in February 2023, hopefully in person. So there will be a call for papers on EUA's website in the autumn, as well as a registration process to attend. There are 3 project-related upcoming events. So yeah, we'd really like to just thank you again for attending. We'll put the survey in the chat now, as we would like you to fill it in. And unless you have questions, we can bid farewell, and yes, we hope to see you again at a future event. So thank you so much.